Speakers. And I'll tell you how we got our next speaker. I was, one evening, my son Adrian calls me up and he says, I'm going to Genoa, Italy. And I said, oh, I'd love to go to Genoa, Italy. He goes, well, you should come. And he said that he was going to go as part of a thing called Cultural Debris. Tom Ruby and Alan Cornett, wave yourselves. They set up these curated tours, meaning they're small tour groups that go to some choice spots in Europe. And they were going to go to Genoa for a week. And I said, that sounds great. I said to my wife, I said, have you ever been to Genoa? She was born and raised in Italy and, knows Italy. And she goes, no, I've never been to Genoa. I said, do you realize that if we don't go to Genoa now, we'll never go there? And she goes, that's probably right. And so we talked about it for about 4 seconds, and we decided to go. And of course, it was just a great, great week that we had. Last year, you heard, if you came to last year's conference, Alan Cornett was one of our speakers. When I met him in Genoa, I said, you've got to come and speak at our conference. This is how we get speakers. You go to Genoa, Italy. One of the other, is a small group touring. One of the other couples there was Josh McKoon and his wife, Jacqueline. And I said, after talking to Josh about a minute, I said, you've got to come and speak at our conference. Why? Well, this guy's got a good resume here. Former state senator in a state. Sure doesn't say on here what state it is. It says District 29, okay? We're going to say Georgia.
Empire State of the South.
Yeah, all right. Named for the King of Prussia, King George. Went to Furman State, University of Alabama. That's a giveaway. And but he was a state senator for a long time, and a lawyer. But he has been the chairman of the Republican Party in Georgia for the last year, and he had his beautiful mug right on national television during the Republican convention when he spoke on the behalf of the delegates when it was during the nomination, right? So he was the guy up there nominating whoever it is that's running for the Republicans. We have to be very careful, All right, it's okay. All right, please welcome Josh McKoon. All right.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. As Dale mentioned, the subject of this talk came up while we were traveling together, and I'm very grateful for the Chesterton Society for a lot of reasons, but really most of all the people that I've been able to meet. And I know he mentioned Tom and Alan, but they have just been such great friends, and I'm so grateful for their friendship, not only on what was one of the best things I've done in a very long time, which was spend a week in Genoa, Italy. But today, I want to spend my time with you. I am a lawyer, and I am a recovering politician. But I'm here today to make an argument. I'm here to try to persuade you about some things. This is not necessarily an academic talk. It's more certainly incorporates some evidence, but kind of like when I make a closing argument, I'm trying to take some facts, marshal them, and hopefully at the end I will have convinced you of the wisdom of my position. Now let me see here. There we go. So I always like to talk a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the call to make change and why do we need change? What do we mean by change? The two keys that I believe are necessary to make change, which are political engagement and education. A little bit about political engagement, the how, the why, some case studies that I wanted to talk through with you. The limits to political engagement, because there are very finite limits to what can be accomplished there. And then I want to shift to Chesterton on Education, the Chesterton Schools Network, and why both of these keys are necessary. And then I'm going to close with what I believe the necessary and logical conclusion of what I'm telling you leads us to, which is a call to action. That's me. I will tell you, I do have more than one suit. But I really like this picture. So, as was mentioned, I'm a former state senator. I have had experience in the higher education environment as well as a regulator at the legislative level of education. I'm a parishioner at the Cathedral of Christ the King, and the most important thing is I'm the husband to Jacqueline and the father to Jackson. So that's me. So a little bit about, why we want to make change. I believe very strongly in the quotation that's displayed in front of you, that we are motivated more by love than hate, and love of what is behind us. I got up this morning, I got on a plane to come to Philadelphia. I did not have to register my travel plans with a government bureaucracy. I did not have to get permission from anyone to come here. This group, this gathering is allowed to occur without any, high government official permitting us to exchange ideas and to talk with one another and to have change that perhaps even comes out of the discussions that we're having. And I think sometimes we forget, maybe not the people in this room, but we globally forget how rare that is. What we are living in right now today in the year of our Lord 2024 compared with the entire scope and sweep of human history. And so, yes, there is something that is worth loving and worth preserving and worth keeping. And it just isn't here. It just isn't always going to be here in the absence of positive action. And I know a lot of my contemporaries, I'm 45 years old, they weren't drafted to serve in a war. Many signed up voluntarily after 9/11. But we haven't been called upon, at least people of my age, to make this sort of collective sacrifice. So I think it's easy to forget these normal everyday things that we take for granted about the place and time in which we live. So I think there's a powerful call that we are reminded of with this quote to take action that is necessary to make change, to keep what we have. Now, Chesterton believed in the inherent value and dignity of every person. And he also advocated for a more just distribution of property and power. That doesn't necessarily cleave very easily in our current political discussion. So today's discussion is not really about political parties. It's about the value of being politically engaged. But I think it's important to know what he thought himself. And he thought that the role of faith and reason was important in motivating and sustaining and improving society. The first experience that I had many, many years ago that sort of led to a desire to talk to you about this subject is I have knocked on, 100,000 doors, 50,000, lots of doors. I mean, I've been knocking on doors since before I was old enough to drive a car. to encourage people to vote for this candidate or that candidate. And I would often be greeted by someone that would say, well, I'm a Christian, we don't vote, or I'm a Christian, we don't engage politically, that there was something inherently gross or dirty about being engaged in the world in that sense. And I think you can see here, we do owe each other this terrible loyalty. We can't just be in our bubble, in our household, or in our family and say, well, I'm gonna look out for the people immediately around me. The duty that we owe, obviously, is much greater and grander than that to each and every person in our human family. And so I think Chesterton speaks to that very clearly. There's an emphasis on tradition, reason, and faith. Because, you can talk about change, right? People are always talking about change. They're particularly talking about change in a political context or discussion. But what does that really mean? I think a lot of times that term is used because it can kind of be a blank slate. It can mean whatever you want it to mean. But for Chesterton, it was very clear when he talked about progress here, which I'm sort of using as a watchword for change. He said that we are always changing the world to fit the vision. Should mean we're always changing the world to fit the vision. But what we actually do is we say, well, this is kind of the way things are, so let's change what our vision is. And we know there's a North Star, there's a guiding light in terms of how society is to be rightly ordered. And so progress should mean that we are moving towards that unchanging vision, not the cause of the moment. And he says, and this could probably be said about me, the reformer is always right about what is wrong. I was pretty good when I was in the legislature at spotting things that were wrong. But he is generally wrong about what is right. And I think that's very well said. But you do have to start off by saying and identifying, what is wrong, and having an honest discussion about, well, maybe things are just fine. You just talked about the freedom that we're enjoying and everything else. But I would argue to you that the life that each of us is leading today, we are leading that life because of sacrifices and payments that were made a long, long time ago. We are living off of that. And so it's really important for this generation in the here and now to do what we can and to make our investment to make sure that if somebody is speaking to a group like this 50 years from now, they're having the same conversation and talking about all of the freedoms that they are enjoying. So just a couple of things. These are statistics that probably most of you are familiar with. But we know that there has been, over the last several decades, a significant decline in marriage and family formation. We've seen the U.S. marriage rate fall by nearly 60% since the 1970s. And the percentage of adults who are in the 18 to 34 age bracket who are married has decreased substantially, while we see the number of couples cohabiting increasing significantly. We've seen a decline in childhood literacy, a very significant decline in childhood literacy. We've seen an increase in crime. I know this is a little bit smaller, but you'll see that the violent crime rate in the U.S. increased by 5.5% in 2020, that the homicide rate in the U.S. increased by 30% from 2019 to 2020, the single largest increase in over a century. We've seen a decline in people not only identifying as Christians, but even attending church. And of course, there's been a lot of smarter people than me address you in the past, talking about the rise of the nuns. And you can see that there, those that are religiously unaffiliated. And I think this is a very true statement, that the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge. So while we are still enjoying this incredible moment in history, we are finding ourselves, I believe, challenged like we've never been challenged before. If you think about some of the discussions in the popular culture today, probably the easiest one to flag is simply the statement that there are two biological sexes, right? This is not something that was a controversial statement or something that would lead to an argument just a few years ago, and yet we find ourselves today in a time where that is no longer the case. So there is this extraordinary challenge that is occurring within our culture about what is true and what is good. Chesterton talked a lot about the importance of localism, and that's really something that I will continue to talk about with you this afternoon. A lot of people, and I have a slide on this a little bit later, a lot of people think of, I think, political engagement as some Herculean task that takes every time and bit of your attention. But truthfully, most decisions that matter in your community are not being made in Washington, D.C. They're not being made at great international meetings. They're being made at your Board of Education. They're being made at your city council. They're being made at your county commission. They're being made by volunteer boards that advise those bodies. So Chesterton was absolutely right when he said the focus should be look at local solutions, look at ways to solve problems at the most local level. And alongside that, there is a powerful critique to be made of centralization and bureaucracy. You know, again, whatever problem you're trying to solve, it's not necessarily a question of whether or not the government ought to be trying to solve that problem. It's a question of what level of government should be trying to solve that problem. I was talking to someone at lunch about an issue involving the resolution of a problem, which would be much easier to solve if people in the local community were being empowered to make those decisions. But there is someone far, far away from the people impacted making those decisions. And so that's why localism is something that is important. But localism only works if you have a politically engaged population. If people say, I'm going to let someone else worry about this, I'm going to let an expert handle this, then the likelihood is that that problem is going to get pushed to ever higher levels of government and be centralized and bureaucratized in a way that it would not be if someone raises their hand and says, I'm willing to be involved in helping to solve this problem in our community. And like I said a moment ago, I mean, we think of politics a lot of times in terms of sweeping changes. You know, the Magna Carta, the American Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s or 1960s. And these, you know, are obviously important political movements. But really, as I said, there are ways to engage locally that don't require that sort of, commitment as the Minutemen of the American Revolution gave. You can simply make sure you're voting, become an informed voter, understand the issues, and make sure you turn out and vote. You can weigh in on an issue of importance in your community. You can join a civic club that is looking to solve problems locally, non-government actors that are looking to solve problems locally. I think one of the most famous examples of this around the world is the Rotary International's commitment to polio eradication. I mean, this was a non-government entity that took on an enormous goal, an enormous task, and because of individual decisions made by people around the world that stood up and said, I want to be part of that, they're very close to resolving that issue. supporting an effort that benefits the community. Again, none of this requires somebody to run for office or become a politician or knock on a bunch of doors like I used to do. It just requires you to be present, to show up, to engage, and to say, I want to help. How can I help? And of course, you can go to the next step. You can support a candidate for office. You can run for office yourself. You can go to these public meetings. I will tell you, as a member of the state legislature, I represented 200,000 people, which seemed like a lot of people to me. We almost never got a telephone call about the issues we were facing at the legislature. You might occasionally, if there's an issue that was in the news, but if we had more than 3 people, 3 live human beings from Columbus, Georgia, call my office, we knew there was something very serious going on. So when you think, well, it doesn't matter if I pick up the phone and call these people or write them a letter, it does. And it matters the most when you are dealing with those levels of government that are the closest to you. So again, that didn't require somebody to put a yard sign in their yard or wave a big flag and say, I'm a political person. It just required somebody to say, hey, Josh, are you paying attention to this issue about Medicaid? Are you paying attention to this issue about education funding or educational choice? And it would get our attention. It would get our attention very, very quickly. So there are lots and lots of ways that you can effectively engage, again, without necessarily becoming a political person. So why should you engage? I mean, I've been making this argument a little bit along as we go. But first of all, the decisions are made by the people that show up. You know, issues would get decided many, many times based on the organized voice of a relentless minority, you know, because the great majority did not choose to engage at all. I want to talk about this third bullet for just a moment. One of the things that I think is said very often and is so untrue is that they would say, I don't want you to go up there, Josh, and legislate morality. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know about you, but when I'm faced with a decision, just about any decision, I'm going to ask myself the question, is this good or bad? Is this a good thing or is it a bad thing, right? I'm going to take the values that I have and apply it to that decision in making that decision. So it is simply not true that at your local level of government or your federal government that morality is not being legislated. It's being legislated every single day. The question is, whose morality is being legislated? Whose values are being promoted? Because it's happening. And so whose values are being promoted is directly related to who is engaged in that political process. So it's really, really important to be engaged if you want to see the laws of your society reflect and be in alignment with those moral values and decisions that you believe are for the good. And I say it here probably better than that. The legal and political framework of a society can either encourage or discourage the formation of what is good and true. And so we have I believe, and I believe Chesterton will argue it, a moral obligation to be engaged, to try to make sure that that legal and political framework is as good as it can be. And a committed group can make a difference. I do want to talk through these 3 issues, and I'm keeping a close watch on my time. It is an act of great faith that Dale has allowed a lawyer with a microphone and a captive audience. But I'm going to do my best to mind my time limitation. These are 3 issues that I think are important to talk about, and they kind of go from big to smaller. In the 1990s, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a case involving a Native American tribe that our First Amendment right of free exercise was very, very limited compared to the other rights in the First Amendment. They took the position that if the government had a rational basis, had a reason to restrict your religious freedom, that they could do it. In that case, it was a criminal statute involving drug use. And I know what my position would have been on that particular case. But the principle that was articulated is the principle that in some states, you can draw a straight line from that case, Employment Division versus Smith, to churches being closed due to a public health emergency in the year 2020. Now, at the federal level, this didn't happen in every single state, but at the federal level, you had a committed group of religious leaders, lots of different faiths represented, and they insisted on the passage. It's one of the only times in American history that the Congress has passed a law specifically giving instructions to the U.S. Supreme Court, you can do this, you can't do that, in terms of religious freedom. And what they said was, none of our rights under the Constitution are absolute. There are limitations on all of them. But they said, if you're going to have a challenge, if you're going to have a government policy that restricts the free exercise of religion, you have to have a substantial, compelling government interest to interfere with that right, just like you do with the right of the free press or the right to speak freely. And that came about because a group of faith leaders around the nation over a course of a couple of years put consistent pressure. And it wasn't a politically charged or it's this party or that party. It was just about the principle, about trying to do the right thing. Ethics reform. Everybody has a reason, I guess, they run for office. For me, the overriding principle was, I think that government ought to respond to policy questions by saying, what is the best public policy? Not who's the most important person in the room. And in my state, which I omitted from my biography, in Georgia, we were one of 3 states when I got elected that had no limitation on gifts from lobbyists, people that are representing clients trying to get the legislature to do things, no limit on those gifts from lobbyists to legislators. So you couldn't donate campaign funds to a member of the legislature. But you could take them on a trip. You could take them to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. You could take them to Europe. You could spend as much money as you wanted as long as you disclosed it. I thought that was wrong. So I introduced a bill. The bill didn't go anywhere. It was in committee. The only reason that we ultimately got a gift limitation passed in Georgia 3 years later is that we had a committed group of citizens that eventually lobbied both political parties to put a question on the ballot to say, hey, what do you think about this? Should we have a limitation? And the day of that vote, some of the political leaders in my state said, next year we're going to pass this lobbyist gift limitation into law. And why is that important? It may sound like this esoteric thing, but it was about increasing public confidence in government and making sure everybody had the same access. Everybody can go buy somebody a cup of coffee if they want to. Not everybody can afford to be taking them on a trip for a week to Europe. And then finally, and maybe most importantly of the 3, in 2006, I'm from Columbus, Georgia originally, there was a sales tax passed. And the sales tax said we're going to build this beautiful new public library and we're going to have this enormous, for Columbus, Georgia, almost like a central park in Columbus, in a part of the community where there are children that probably will never travel very far outside of Columbus, Georgia. They would have an outdoor space outside of the asphalt encased world they live in to learn, to play, and it passed. And then the government reneged on that promise, and they said we're not going to move forward with that. And we went through a 3-year battle. It involved going to court, it involved political action, But at the end of the day, they wound up relenting and building this public park, which is used, this was in 2007, it was built in 2009. So for 15 years now, a child that was born when that park was finished is 15 years old. They've been able to learn about science in that park. They've been able to experience nature. It's something that I think will be there for the rest of my life. And it's because of a small group, less than 10 people, who said, we're going to hold our government accountable and we're going to make sure that they follow up with the commitment that they made to the people of our city. And so I just tell you those to say that a small group of people that are committed to a principle can make significant and important change. But everything has its limits. As Chesterton says, for at present we all tend to one mistake. We tend to make politics too important. We tend to forget how huge a part of a man's life is the same under a sultan and a senate, under Nero or St. Louis. There are limits to what can be accomplished politically. It depends on who's in charge. It depends on who shows up. It depends on a lot of other things. It doesn't mean that political engagement is not important. I hope you have probably discerned by now, I think it's very important. But it is not the only thing. And if it is the only thing you are relying on to make the progress to match the vision that Chesterton talked about, you will ultimately not be successful. And that brings me to the other part of what I want to talk about with you today. And that is Chesterton on the question of education. Chesterton talked clearly about the importance of classical education in developing critical thinking and moral values. Now, I will say, I'm involved, my day job involves technical education. I think it's important to learn trades and skills. I'm not saying those things are unimportant as I talk to you today. But I think it is equally important, as Chesterton argued, that someone emerge from their formal education with the ability to think critically and with moral values. They should be asking big questions. They should be wrestling with the ultimate questions of human existence. And he did criticize the mechanization and standardization in modern education. Education shouldn't be reduced to only vocational training. You should come out of, I hope you will come out of education with marketable skills that allow you to provide for your family, but that should not be the end-all be-all. And I think that's such an important point, because as he says, education is the soul of a society. And the soul of a society is a lot more than being able to build a widget, right? Education has a central role in shaping character and virtue. The need for education to go beyond academics to include moral and spiritual development is key. And that the teacher is not simply there asking the class to open their books and answer questions and take a form test or fill out the worksheet, but that there are personal relationships. I remember so many of my teachers, both as a kindergarten through 12th grade student, as a college student at Furman University, and yes, as a law school student at the University of Alabama. That used to be something people would get very upset with me about, being a University of Alabama graduate because of Nick Saban, and now people just tell me, they express their sympathies, For those of you that are college football fans, you know what I am talking about. But again, that teacher-student relationship is far beyond simply facilitating academic material that is put before the student. And it was also important to encourage a sense of wonder and curiosity in students, for students to want to learn for the sake of learning. The object of opening the mind as of opening the mouth, is to shut it again on something solid, right? So this does not match a lot of, I'm not saying everywhere, but a lot of the educational opportunities afforded to students around the United States. I don't think it is something that we would necessarily describe many, not all, but many of the educational options that are out there. So that leads me to talk a little bit to you about the Chesterton Schools Network. I became aware of it by coming to this conference. I didn't know what was going on with all of that. But to me, the work that is being done by the Chesterton Schools Network answers this call that Chesterton has put out. You know, because we find ourselves in a time and place where so many of the educational options available refuse to consider the ultimate questions of human existence. And I'd really encourage you to read that last bullet point, which I did not write. That is from their website. But those two sentences to me are incredibly inspirational, to say we make it our mission to prepare our students to triumph over the materialism and despair that pervade our culture and to accept our Lord's offer to have life and have it abundantly. To me, this is the answer to the critique of modern education, is to make sure that there is that opportunity to go to a school that has a mission like that one. So why do we need both? If I talked about politics a whole bunch to y'all today, and then I said, well, there are limits to it, and education is the answer, why do you need both? And I would say that rightly ordered, it takes education and politics together to create the environment that allows a just and moral society to flourish. Those two things together, you can't really separate them. If you don't maintain the environment, then the ability to flourish goes away. And if you don't have people who have been developed and cultivated mind, body, and soul, then you'll lack the political will to continue. So it takes both working together to make the society that I think we all have had for many years the opportunity to live in, and that we would like to see our children and grandchildren be able to enjoy. This is from the same day, and I know once again, I do have other suits. This is not the only suit I own. But I share this with you to share one thing about politics that's important to me. I think people think a lot of times of political engagement in terms of you're in opposition to or in an adversarial relationship with another person. We had this election for party chairman, and as Dale mentioned, I got elected a year ago. The person on my left and right, those were my opponents, and this is right after the vote was announced. And I just want you to know it is entirely possible to spend months and months saying, I want this job, and somebody else standing right next to you say, I want this job, and you're all getting along at the end. You know, that is possible, you know, if you choose to do these things with the right heart and spirit. So my call to action to you as I wrap up within the 45 minutes is number one, find something meaningful to you in your community where you can impact by engaging politically. Look for a local way to be involved. There are no shortage of opportunities. And the other thing I will say, which is perhaps a bolder goal or casting a broader vision, but one that I think is worthy of those of you in attendance today, is we should not rest from leaving this place until we can say that every child in the United States of America, if their parents want to give them the opportunity to go to a school that is going to offer them a classical education, that is going to be as concerned with the cultivation of their soul as their mind, that should be the goal, is that we don't rest until that happens. And I believe it's going to happen. I do. I believe it's going to happen, and it's going to happen in my lifetime. But it takes each and every one of us taking that positive action together. And these are all the ways you can bother me or tell me you had problems with what I said today. That's my phone number, email address, Twitter. I know everybody loves Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, and my LinkedIn. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Does anybody have a question? Here's one right here.
Thank you for plain but concise presentation. I wonder if you could recommend biographies that would exemplify that.
Biographies that would exemplify.
Of people that have that practice that or successes through that.
So I could give you a couple of examples in terms of movements that I think started very small, but accomplished these great things. One of those is the March of Dimes, which was famously started by Franklin Roosevelt's personal. He was his banker, I think, but he went to him he went to Warm Springs with him quite a bit, which was in my old Senate district, and they started with a handful of people that said, we're going to make these services more available around the country. It was long before there was any kind of social safety net available, and they did that. But I'm glad to send around and can get to Dale some biographies of folks that I think would be particularly worthwhile reading. But I think there are examples every day. I think about Jenny Beth Martin, who's a friend of mine, when they had the 2009, 2010, the so-called Tea Party movement. Jenny Beth was a homemaker, school-age children in the home, and she said, I want to take this moment that people really want to see what they can do in their local communities to assist their government, and she's built a national network of like-minded people, and they're getting many, many things accomplished. And I'm not talking about bills being passed. I'm talking about changing the culture around engagement with their local government. So I will give you a more full answer to that question, but that's the best I can do at the moment.
Thank you, Josh. Tim Mitchell from Australia. From afar, it seems that politics in this country has, over the last few decades, gone from the Republicans being the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant party of the elites to now the party where all the Christians go, including all the Catholics. We have a similar manifestation of that in Australia. I think probably more extreme in some examples and some states less so. That seems to be a problem for me. I liked your final photograph, and also like the fact that you didn't urge anyone to join a particular party. You just urged everyone to be involved. But that broader concern that I outlined, just interested in your comments on that.
Yeah, I'm very troubled by quite a few cleavages in American politics, not only necessarily involving people of faith, but when I was first getting involved, and I think you said it in your question, the racial sort of cleavage between the parties. And I will tell you, when I was in Wisconsin, as Dale mentioned earlier this month, we had the largest number of black delegates and alternates to the Republican convention, the largest number of federal elected officials. And I say that not to promote the Republican Party. I say that to say I felt very good that people don't feel like there's a white party or a black party. That's a really dangerous thing, I think, in our politics. And I think by the same token, the idea that there's a Christian political party, I think I made reference to that earlier. We could talk about a whole lot of different issues, and there are issues we would say people on the left align closer to, what we as people of faith would say this is the way to move forward. So I think we have to be really careful in the political rhetoric we use, and the discussions we have, those of us that are actively engaged in election campaigns, to make it clear that people of faith, people of conscience, lots of different reasons to support lots of different political causes. I hope that the takeaway for me today is not, if you're a person of faith, you should do this or that in terms of what your politics is. What I do hope you take away from today is that I absolutely should be involved if I'm not involved. I should follow whatever my conscience is telling me to do, but I need to find that place where I can make a difference and be involved politically.
One more question.
As someone who's been politically engaged since before the Reagan era, I say amen to what you just said. And I think something that is implicit in what you said is leverage. You talk about starting small, getting good groups, how the effect of a few people calling your office. In other words, they were leveraging. So I would encourage people to find ways to leverage their effects by identifying and collecting the names of people who share similar interests. And then when something comes up, they know who to rally, if you will, on that particular issue that is of a concern.
And establishing those relationships, everyone in this room has a particular expertise. I will tell you that there was a medical professional who I did not know before I got elected to the state legislature, and he made it his business to get to know me, so that when I had a bill coming up that I was going to need to vote on, he became sort of my go-to expert, because I didn't have it's not like Congress, I didn't have a staff of, however many to rely on. I was calling people back home in the community. So you really don't know what kind of influence you can have if you're intentional about creating those relationships.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you very much.
All right. Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back for the second part of The Everlasting Man. All right? See you in a little bit.